August 15, 1945, a single message transmitted across the Pacific, echoed through broken cities, sinking fleets, and shattered hearts. It wasn't just the end of a war. It was the end of an empire and the silence after the storm that had raged for 20 years. This is the story of the message that ended World War II. Inside the Imperial Palace, chaos reigned. The army wanted to fight to the last man. The Navy knew the war was lost. And the Emperor, silent, isolated, prepared to speak words no Japanese ruler had ever spoken before. The message was simple, yet unthinkable. To the good and loyal subjects, we must endure the unendurable. It would be the first time the Japanese people would hear the voice of their divine emperor. But before the broadcast could air, a coup began. For Japan, the war didn't begin at Pearl Harbor. It began in 1931, when the Imperial Army seized Manchuria, igniting 2 decades of conflict across Asia. From China to the Pacific, the empire expanded, unstoppable, unchallenged, and unrelenting. But behind the victories, Japan's leaders were trapped in a dangerous illusion that honor could overcome reality. By 1945, that illusion had turned to ashes. Tokyo was in ruins. Hiroshima and Nagasaki lay in radioactive silence. The emperor himself faced an impossible decision: surrender or extinction. August 14th, 1945, just hours before the emperor's surrender speech was to be broadcast, a group of military officers launched a desperate coup to stop it. Their goal: destroy the recording, overthrow the emperor's peace faction, and continue the war, even if Japan burned to the ground. They called it the Kyujo Incident. For 9 tense hours, soldiers searched the Imperial Palace, hunting for the emperor's recorded message, hidden inside a safe room by loyal palace officials. Outside, Tokyo was already under Allied attack. Inside, Japan was at war with itself. At noon, on August 15th, 1945, the emperor's voice echoed across the airwaves. For the first time, the Japanese people heard the man they called a god. After pondering deeply the general trends of the world and the actual conditions of our empire, we have decided to effect a settlement of the present situation. Few understood the formal, archaic language, but everyone understood the tone. Japan had surrendered. In that single moment, millions wept, some out of relief, some out of disbelief, and others out of despair. But the war was over. The emperor's surrender message wasn't just a speech. It was a signal, the final act of a war that began 20 years earlier in Manchuria. A war fought not just with weapons, but with ideology, pride, and desperation. The emperor's words were more than surrender. They were a confession. A nation built on honor had finally bowed to reality. And from the ashes of that moment, a new Japan would rise, rebuilt not by warriors, but by survivors. Declassified records revealed that Japan's intelligence officers had already predicted defeat months before Hiroshima. Their reports warned that continued war would lead to national suicide. But pride, fear, and tradition silenced the truth until that single message broke through. Today, historians call it the Jewel Voice broadcast. But for the people who heard it, it was simply the message that ended a 20-year war. The night before Japan's surrender, deep inside the Imperial Palace, a secret was unfolding. While Tokyo still burned and the army debated rebellion, the emperor, silent and expressionless, made his final command: prepare to record my words. It was the first time a Japanese emperor had ever spoken directly to his people. 2 phonograph discs were placed before him. The engineers, trembling, bowed so low their foreheads touched the floor. As the microphone clicked to life, Hirohito spoke, not as a god of war, but as a man confronting the weight of 2 million dead souls. Each word carried centuries of divine authority and the unbearable grief of a nation on its knees. When it was done, the recordings were sealed in a lacquered box and hidden inside the palace vault. They would become the most valuable and most hunted objects in Japan. But not everyone would allow surrender. In the shadows of the same palace, a young officer named Major Kenji Hatanaka believed the emperor had been deceived. He called surrender a betrayal of every soldier who had died for the empire. And so, on the night of August 14th, 1945, he launched a desperate rebellion. The mission was clear: seize the palace, capture the emperor, destroy the surrender recording before dawn. As lightning cracked across the city, 600 soldiers marched toward the imperial compound, their rifles gleaming with rain and madness. It was Japan's final battle, not against America, but against itself. Just after midnight, the rebels stormed the gates of the emperor's home. The loyal guards, sworn to protect him, resisted, but were overpowered. For the first time in history, Japanese soldiers turned their weapons toward their own emperor. The palace fell into chaos. Doors were smashed open. Officers shouted orders through smoke-filled halls. They searched every room for the precious phonograph, the single object that could end the war they refused to lose. But fate, or loyalty, kept it hidden, locked deep within the walls, guarded by silence and courage. As the coup raged outside, Emperor Hirohito remained calm. He knew soldiers had betrayed him, that chaos had consumed his own palace. But he did not flee. He did not hide. He simply waited, his white robes glowing in the dim light, listening to the storm that decided Japan's future. In those quiet hours before dawn, he was no longer a god, nor a ruler, only a man facing the ghosts of his empire. While soldiers searched, a handful of palace courtiers risked everything to protect the emperor's voice. Men like Yoshihiro Tokugawa and Takeshi Nara, names history barely remembers, became the silent guardians of peace. They hid the recordings behind heavy doors, disguised them as routine documents, and carried them past armed checkpoints with trembling hands. If caught, they would be executed as traitors. But they understood. Without those two fragile discs, the war would never end. By morning, the rebellion had collapsed. Loyal troops surrounded the palace. Major Hatanaka, realizing his dream of eternal war was lost, fled into the streets of Tokyo. He rode his motorcycle across the city, shouting to anyone who would listen, pleading for Japan to keep fighting. No one answered. The people were too tired, too broken, too human to fight anymore. At 11 a.m., Hatanaka stopped his bike near the imperial gates. He pulled out his pistol, placed it to his heart, and whispered, "Long live the emperor." One final gunshot marked the end of Japan's last rebellion. 1 hour later, at precisely 12 o'clock noon, the nation fell silent. Factories stopped. Soldiers stood at attention. Families gathered around wooden radios, their hands shaking. Then, the air cracked with static, and for the first time in history, the Japanese people heard their emperor's voice. To our good and loyal subjects, the words were soft, distant, formal, and poetic. But beneath them was something no one had ever heard before: defeat. Few understood the emperor's classical language, but they didn't need to. They heard the tremor in his tone, the sorrow in his breath. We must endure the unendurable and suffer what must be suffered. Those words shattered centuries of divine pride. The god had spoken, not of victory, but of surrender. Millions wept, some out of grief, some out of disbelief, and some out of relief that the killing was finally over. Minutes after the broadcast ended, no one moved, no one spoke. The silence was heavier than the war itself. Across a nation that once shouted Banzai, there was only quiet and the sound of wind passing through the ruins. August 15th, 1945, the day the rising sun finally bowed to the horizon. The day an empire built on conquest was humbled by a single voice. And the day Japan, for the first time in 2 decades, finally knew peace. The next morning, the city was still. No parades, no victory cries, only silence, the kind that follows a storm that has destroyed everything in its path. Men wandered through the ashes of their homes, unsure whether to feel shame or relief. Mothers held photographs of sons who would never return. Children looked up at the gray sky, too young to understand that their world had ended and a new one had just begun. The war was over, but peace felt foreign. For a nation that had lived 20 years under the banner of honor or death, surrender was not just defeat. It was an identity crisis. The rising sun had set, but somewhere in that quiet morning, a new dawn began to form. Inside the imperial palace, the emperor sat in silence. He had spoken the words the nation needed, but they had not been easy to say. For decades, his people believed him divine, born of the sun goddess herself. And yet, in that single broadcast, he had admitted the unthinkable, that Japan had failed. That night, Hirohito wrote quietly in his private diary, "I could not bear the thought of further bloodshed in my name. My heart is torn between duty and sorrow." He was no longer the living god. He was now a man burdened by the lives lost under his reign. And that realization, more than defeat, marked the true fall of the Japanese Empire. 17 days later, the world watched history end on the deck of a ship. The USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, became the stage for the final act of World War II. Japanese officials, dressed in black mourning coats, stepped forward with trembling hands. Across the table stood General Douglas MacArthur, the face of victory, calm, stoic, and unflinching. When Japanese Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed the instrument of surrender, the pen's scratch across paper was softer than a whisper, yet heavier than any bomb. At that moment, the war that began in 1931, the 20-year storm that consumed millions, was finally over. The guns went silent. The world exhaled. In the months that followed, Japan was a nation stripped bare of its army, its empire, and its illusions. The people who once shouted, "Long live the emperor," now whispered prayers for food. Cities were nothing but skeletons of concrete. Entire families lived in the ruins of schools and shrines. The imperial broadcast had ended the war, but it had also taken away everything familiar. And in that emptiness, the Japanese people began to search, not for glory, but for meaning. While the world demanded justice, the Japanese people demanded survival. They rebuilt with what they had: broken bricks, rusted metal, and unbroken spirit. Temples reopened, schools resumed, and the emperor, once seen as divine, walked among the common people, bowing to them as equals. It was a gesture the world had never seen before, a god bowing to mortals. And in that act of humility, the people found strength. Under American supervision, Japan wrote a new constitution, this time not as an empire, but as a democracy. Article 9 declared, "The Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation. No more soldiers, no more conquests." The sword was laid to rest, and though it was written under occupation, it became Japan's proudest promise to the world that it would never again bring suffering to others. Justice arrived swiftly but unevenly. In 1946, the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal began. The Nuremberg of the East. Generals, ministers, and admirals were tried for crimes of aggression, atrocities, and genocide. They bowed deeply before the court, their eyes hollow, their voices quiet. But one name was never called: the emperors. By order of MacArthur, Hirohito was spared, not as a favor, but as necessity. Without him, Japan might collapse into chaos. With him, it could be rebuilt. It was a political choice and a moral question that history still debates. On New Year's Day, 1946, the emperor spoke again, this time to redefine himself. In what became known as the Humanity Declaration, he renounced his divine status. He said plainly, "The ties between us and our people are not those of a god to his subjects, but of a father to his children." For the first time, Japan's ruler was no longer sacred. He was simply human. And in his humanity, his people found their redemption. But peace could not erase pain. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki carried invisible scars, radiation, grief, and guilt. They called themselves Hibakusha, the bomb-affected people, living reminders of what happens when pride outruns compassion. Every year, on August 6th and 9th, they gather to ring the bells of peace, not to curse the past, but to warn the future. In less than a decade, Japan transformed. Where fire once fell from the sky, neon lights now glowed. The sound of air raids was replaced by the hum of industry. The world called it the Japanese economic miracle. But it was more than economics. It was redemption through creation. The same discipline that once fueled war now fueled progress. The samurai spirit had found a new weapon: imagination. Decades later, the Emperor's surrender recording still survives. The original Jewel voice broadcast. Its surface is cracked, its sound distorted by age, but its words still hold the power to silence a room. Every Japanese child studies it. Every historian reveres it. Because in those trembling words, Japan's soul was reborn. When the Allied forces entered Japan, there were no cheers, no flags of welcome, no parades of liberation, only faces, tired, thin, and blank, staring at the soldiers who had once been their enemies. The Americans expected defiance. Instead, they found discipline. Every street they marched through was swept clean. Every citizen bowed, quietly, respectfully. Japan had not been conquered by might. It had surrendered to exhaustion, to hunger, to grief. To the truth that the empire they had believed eternal had crumbled into dust. The soldiers of the rising sun were now shadows, silently placing down their rifles, their swords, their pride. In the ashes of Tokyo and Hiroshima, a strange peace began to take root, not born of victory, but of surrender. Two men defined Japan's rebirth. One, a god who became human. The other, a conqueror who became a teacher. When General Douglas MacArthur met Emperor Hirohito on September 27, 1945, the air in the room was heavier than any battlefield. Hirohito entered dressed in a black morning coat, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes calm but hollow. MacArthur, tall and unbuttoned, towered beside him, a living symbol of victory. For a brief moment, they simply stared at each other, neither as enemy nor as ally, but as two men who had seen too much death. MacArthur expected apology. Instead, Hirohito said quietly, "I come to offer myself to the judgment of your nation. The people are blameless." MacArthur never forgot those words. In that instant, he decided the emperor would live, because in his survival, Japan might learn to rebuild itself. The first order of the new Japan was disarmament. The empire's once proud military, the largest in Asia, was dissolved overnight. Tanks were cut apart for scrap. Warplanes were grounded and left to rust on silent airfields. The Imperial Navy, once feared from China to Hawaii, was sunk by its own men, piece by piece, under the supervision of American officers. Millions of soldiers returned home in silence. They carried no medals, no triumph, no welcome. They had fought for honor and come home to hunger. In rural towns, former officers became farmers again, digging in the same earth where they once swore to die. They were not told to forget the war. They were told to live despite it. And for the first time in generations, Japan had no army, no empire, only people. The physical destruction was beyond comprehension. 66 major cities reduced to rubble. 2/3 of Japan's industry gone. More than 3 million dead. In Tokyo alone, a single night of firebombing killed 100,000 civilians, a number so vast that even the government stopped counting. There were no graves big enough, no words deep enough. Entire generations had vanished. But amid that destruction, something extraordinary happened. The people who had once been told to die for their emperor now began to live for each other. Teachers reopened schools in burned-out classrooms. Priests held prayers in the ruins of temples. Women rebuilt homes from the bricks that once buried them. For the first time, the Japanese spirit was not being used for war, but for survival. Under the watch of General MacArthur, a team of Japanese and American minds worked day and night to create something the nation had never known: a constitution not of conquest, but of compassion. In February 1946, a single article changed Japan's fate forever. The Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation. Article 9, the Clause of Eternal Peace. It banned Japan from maintaining an army or waging war again. It was revolutionary. A warrior nation, once defined by the sword, now defined itself by the absence of it. Some protested, calling it humiliation, but others saw it as purification, the cleansing of blood from a nation's soul. And thus, Japan was reborn, not as an empire, but as a democracy. On January 1st, 1946, Emperor Hirohito spoke again. But this time, he did not speak of war. This time, he spoke of truth. His voice trembled as he read the words that would change 1,000 years of faith. The ties between us and our people are not those of a god and his subjects, but of a father and his children. For the first time in history, the emperor declared himself human. He was no longer divine, no longer the descendant of the sun goddess, but a man who had chosen peace over power. Millions wept once again, not from defeat, but from awakening. The veil of divinity had fallen, and behind it stood a man who looked like them, spoke like them, and carried the same grief they did. The American occupation was not one of punishment, but of transformation. For the first time, democracy touched the soil of Japan. Women gained the right to vote. Censorship was lifted. Education was reformed. And slowly, painfully, Japan began to rise, not through domination, but through determination. Food was scarce. Cities were broken. But the people's will was iron. They built with their hands, their hearts, and their memories. Every plank of wood, Every brick of stone became a quiet act of defiance against despair itself. By 1950, a miracle was unfolding. The land of ashes was coming back to life. Fields once abandoned for war were green again. Factories that once built tanks now made sewing machines, radios, and bicycles. The same discipline that once fueled war was now fueling work. And the same spirit that once died for the emperor now lived for family. In less than a decade, Japan's heart began to beat again. Not as an empire, but as a nation reborn from its own ruin. But no rebirth comes without remembering what burned it down. Every August, bells ring in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The sound travels across water, through air, through generations who never saw the bombs, but still feel their echo. Each chime says what words cannot, that peace is not a gift, it is a responsibility. Children fold paper cranes in memory of Sadako Sasaki, the little girl who believed that 1,000 cranes could bring healing to a world that had lost its heart. And in that story, one small fragile life, Japan found the meaning of peace stronger than any victory. The message that ended a 20-year war still speaks, through time, through silence, through memory. In museums, people still gather to hear the crackling voice of a man who stopped a world from burning. The Jewel Voice broadcast remains sacred, not because it ended a war, but because it began a new way to live. Generations later, Japan stands as proof that surrender is not the end of pride, but the beginning of wisdom. The emperor's words, "We must endure the unendurable," were once a sentence of sorrow. Today, they are a promise of strength, a reminder that even in defeat, there can be dignity, and even in silence, there can be salvation. 80 years have passed since that voice filled the airwaves. The trembling words that ended the bloodshed and began Japan's long journey from empire to peace. Today, the nation stands reborn, a land of progress, art, and quiet resilience. Its cities hum with life. Its people walk freely beneath the same sun that once watched the world burn. But beneath the neon lights and the endless movement, there remains a whisper, the echo of that day when everything stopped. To our good and loyal subjects, we must endure the unendurable. Those words are more than history. They are a mirror reflecting what humanity is capable of, both in its darkest and its most enlightened moments. Japan did not win the war, but it won something far greater, the courage to rebuild, to forgive, to live. From ashes to innovation, from silence to strength, the spirit of that single message still endures, not as a memory of defeat, but as a testament to the power of peace. Because sometimes the most powerful victory in history is not the one won by armies, but the one whispered through a voice that chose humanity over hate. And on that August day in 1945, a god spoke as a man, and in doing so, saved a nation. The message that ended a 20-year war, inspired by real events, dedicated to every soul who chose peace over pride. Let the nation endure the unendurable.